Machiavelli once wrote, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can understand what you feel." I learned this the hard way during my first corporate job at a tech startup in Austin back in 2018. I was 26, fresh out of business school, and completely naive about office politics. I believed that hard work and merit would naturally lead to recognition and advancement. I'd stay late, deliver projects ahead of schedule, and always volunteer for extra assignments. Meanwhile, my colleague Jake would leave at 5 sharp, spend his lunch breaks networking with executives, and somehow always seemed to know about opportunities before they were officially announced. The wake-up call came during our quarterly review meeting. Our VP of Sales, Patricia, was discussing the new team lead position that everyone knew I was qualified for. I had the best performance metrics, the most completed projects, and had even trained 2 new hires. But as I sat there confidently waiting for my name to be called, she announced that Jake would be taking the role. My stomach dropped. After the meeting, I cornered Jake in the break room and asked him directly how he'd managed to get the promotion. He looked at me with this knowing smile and said something I'll never forget. "David, you're great at doing the work, but terrible at making sure people see you doing it. I've been having coffee with Patricia every Tuesday for 6 months, updating her on my projects and asking for her advice. She feels invested in my success because she helped shape it." That's when it hit me. I had been playing by rules that didn't exist. While I was focused on the substance of my work, Jake was managing perceptions. He understood that in any organization, people make decisions based on what they observe and feel, not necessarily on objective data buried in spreadsheets. Patricia saw Jake as proactive, strategic, and leadership material because he had deliberately created that impression. I realized that Machiavelli wasn't teaching manipulation. He was revealing human nature in its rawest form. People judge leaders not just by results, but by how those results are presented and perceived. The colleague who gets promoted isn't always the most competent. It's the one who best manages the impression of competence while actually being competent enough to deliver. The next Monday, I started having weekly check-ins with Patricia myself. I began framing my project updates as strategic insights rather than just status reports. Instead of saying, "I finished the client onboarding process," I'd say, "I've streamlined our client onboarding to reduce time to value by 30%, which should help us with retention." Same work, different framing. Within 4 months, I was promoted to senior analyst. Jake remained stuck in his team lead role because, while he was excellent at managing up, he hadn't invested enough in actually developing his team or improving processes. His perception management had gotten him 1 promotion, but without substance to back it up, he hit a ceiling. This experience taught me that we live in a world where perception shapes opportunity, but sustainable success requires backing up that perception with real value. The people who truly thrive long-term are those who understand this dual reality and master both sides of the equation. I started paying attention to how successful people around me managed their professional image while delivering genuine results. I noticed patterns in how they communicated achievements, timed announcements, and positioned themselves during high-visibility moments. It wasn't about being fake or manipulative. It was about being strategic with truth. The lesson wasn't just about office politics, though. I began applying this principle to every area of my life. In dating, I learned that attraction isn't just about being a good person. It's about presenting your good qualities in ways that others can actually perceive and appreciate. In networking, I discovered that people connect more with how you make them feel than with your resume credentials. But here's what I found most interesting. Once you start seeing the world through Machiavelli's lens, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice how everything from political campaigns to social media influencers operates on this same principle of managing perception while hopefully delivering substance. The winners aren't necessarily the most talented. They're the ones who best understand how human psychology actually works. Machiavelli understood that everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. This principle saved my career during what could have been a disaster at a client presentation in Chicago 3 years ago. I was representing my consulting firm in front of the executives at a major retail chain, pitching a digital transformation project worth $200,000. The night before, I'd gotten food poisoning from some questionable sushi and spent most of the evening in my hotel bathroom. By morning, I looked terrible, pale, exhausted, and definitely not like someone who should be trusted with a six-figure project. Here's the thing about first impressions. You get about 30 seconds to establish credibility before people's minds are made up. I knew that walking into that boardroom looking sick would immediately undermine everything I was about to say. So I made a strategic decision that went against every honest bone in my body. I stopped at a CVS, bought some concealer, and spent 20 minutes in my rental car making myself look human again. Then I arrived at their office 15 minutes early, introduced myself to the receptionist by name, and asked about the company photos on the wall. When the CEO, Margaret, came to greet me, I was standing confidently, looking engaged with their company culture, not slumped in a chair checking my phone. The first thing Margaret said was, "You seem genuinely interested in what we do here." That comment told me everything. She wasn't evaluating my consulting skills yet. She was evaluating whether I was the type of person she wanted to work with. In those first few moments, I had communicated energy, preparation, and respect for their business. During the presentation, I felt terrible, but I had already established the impression that I was sharp and attentive. When I spoke slowly and deliberately, which was actually because I was trying not to get sick, they interpreted it as thoughtfulness and confidence. When I paused before answering questions, again, because my brain was foggy, they saw it as careful consideration. We won the contract. But here's the interesting part. 6 months later, after delivering excellent results, Margaret told me that she had chosen our firm partly because I seemed more substantial than the other consultants they'd met. She said the others felt rushed or overeager, while I appeared calm and confident. She had no idea that my composure was actually just me trying not to throw up. This experience taught me that first impressions aren't about being perfect. They're about controlling the initial narrative. People make snap judgments about competence, trustworthiness, and leadership potential within seconds of meeting you. Those judgments become the lens through which they interpret everything else you do. I started experimenting with this principle in other areas. When meeting potential dates, I'd arrive 5 minutes early and order something simple, so I appeared relaxed when they arrived. In job interviews, I'd research one specific detail about the company's recent projects and mention it naturally in conversation. For networking events, I'd have one genuinely interesting question prepared about the industry rather than just talking about myself. The results were dramatic. People began describing me as impressive or put together, even when I felt completely unprepared internally. I realized that confidence isn't a feeling. It's a performance that becomes reality when others believe in it and reflect it back to you. But I also learned the limits of this approach. A good first impression opens doors, but you still have to deliver once you're inside. The colleagues who relied purely on charm without substance eventually got exposed. The key is using that initial credibility to buy yourself time to prove your actual value. What fascinated me most was how this principle extended beyond professional settings. I noticed that people who seemed to effortlessly attract opportunities weren't necessarily more talented. They were just better at managing those crucial first moments when relationships are formed and opportunities are decided. Machiavelli warned that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. I discovered the truth of strategic silence during a salary negotiation that completely changed how I approach high-stakes conversations. It was spring of 2021, and I was up for a promotion at my marketing agency in Denver. My boss, Rachel, had called me into her office to discuss my new role and compensation. I had done my research, knew my market value, and was ready to negotiate for a $15,000 raise. I walked in confident, armed with data and talking points. Rachel opened with, "We're really excited to offer you the senior strategy position. The salary will be $68,000. This was only a $5,000 increase from my current position, and I knew the market rate was closer to $75,000. Every instinct told me to immediately launch into my prepared argument about why I deserved more. Instead, I remembered something my mentor had told me about negotiations. The first person to speak after a proposal usually loses. So I just sat there. I nodded slightly, maintained eye contact, and said absolutely nothing. The silence felt eternal, probably 15 seconds, but it felt like 5 minutes. I could see Rachel starting to fidget, and I knew something was happening. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. Of course, there's also the performance bonus structure we haven't discussed yet, which could add another 8 to 10,000 annually. I still didn't respond. Another pause. And we're also looking at adjusting the entire salary band for this position, so there might be room for movement on the base as well. By staying silent, I had gotten her to negotiate against herself before I'd even stated my position. She had revealed that there was flexibility in the offer and additional compensation I hadn't even known about. When I finally spoke, I simply said, "I appreciate the offer. Can you walk me through the total compensation structure so I can understand the full picture?" That one conversation taught me that silence isn't passive. It's one of the most powerful tools you can use in any negotiation or difficult conversation. When you resist the urge to fill every pause, you create psychological pressure that often works in your favor. People are uncomfortable with silence and will frequently reveal information or make concessions just to break the tension. I started applying this principle everywhere. When my landlord tried to raise my rent, instead of immediately arguing, I just listened to his entire explanation and then sat quietly for a moment before asking, "Is that your final number?" The pause made him uncomfortable enough that he offered a smaller increase without me having to negotiate. In team meetings, when someone would propose a questionable idea, instead of jumping in with objections, I'd just nod thoughtfully and wait. Often, someone else would voice the concerns I had, or the person proposing would start second-guessing themselves and modify their suggestion without any pushback from me. Dating became more interesting too. When someone would test me with a provocative comment or question, instead of rushing to defend myself or impress them, I'd just smile slightly and wait. This approach filtered out people who were looking for reactive responses and attracted those who appreciated thoughtfulness. The key insight was understanding that in our culture of constant communication, silence has become rare and therefore powerful. Everyone expects immediate responses, constant feedback, and continuous dialogue. When you break that pattern strategically, you stand out and often gain psychological advantage. But I also learned the limits of this technique. Silence works best when you hold some form of leverage or when the other person needs something from you. If you're in a weak position, prolonged silence can just make you seem difficult or disengaged. The art is knowing when to deploy it. What surprised me most was how this principle affected my own thinking. By forcing myself to pause before responding, I made better decisions and avoided saying things I'd later regret. Silence didn't just change how others perceived me, it actually made me more strategic and thoughtful in real time. I began to notice how the most successful people I knew shared this trait. They spoke less, but carried more weight when they did speak. They understood that words have more impact when they're not competing with noise, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Machiavelli observed that men are more bound by the benefits they confer than by those they receive. I learned this counterintuitive truth during my first year running a small marketing team in Portland, when I almost lost my best employee by trying too hard to help her. Sarah was incredibly talented but struggling with confidence in client presentations. My instinct was to protect her. I'd handle the difficult clients myself, give her the easier accounts, and constantly reassure her that she was doing great work. I thought I was being a supportive manager, but after 3 months she seemed increasingly distant and started mentioning other job opportunities. The wake-up call came during our quarterly one-on-one when Sarah said something that completely flipped my understanding of leadership. "I appreciate that you want to help me, but I feel like you don't trust me with real challenges. I want to contribute more, not just be managed." I realized that by constantly giving to her, I had made her feel like a charity case rather than a valued team member. That week, I completely changed my approach. Instead of protecting Sarah from our most demanding client, I asked for her help with their upcoming campaign strategy. I told her honestly that I was struggling with their creative direction and needed her perspective. The shift in her demeanor was immediate. She sat up straighter, started asking probing questions, and took ownership of finding solutions. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had developed a campaign concept that not only satisfied our difficult client, but led to a contract extension worth $30,000. More importantly, she came to me afterward and said, "This is the kind of work I want to be doing. How can I take on more projects like this?" By asking for her help instead of offering mine, I had transformed her from someone looking to leave into someone fighting to stay. I started applying this principle deliberately across my team. When our junior designer, Marcus, was struggling with time management, instead of giving him templates and processes, I asked him to help me figure out how to streamline workflows for the entire team. He spent 2 weeks analyzing our bottlenecks and created a system that improved everyone's efficiency by 20%. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When people invest their time, energy, and expertise in helping you solve problems, they develop psychological ownership of the outcome. They can't help but become more committed because walking away would mean abandoning something they helped create. It's like they're protecting their own investment. I saw this pattern everywhere, once I started looking for it. The most loyal employees weren't those who received the most benefits. They were the ones who felt most essential to their company's success. In relationships, the friends who lasted longest weren't those I constantly helped, but those who had helped me through difficult times and felt genuinely needed. Even in sales, I discovered that asking potential clients for their expertise and input on challenges they understood better than I did created stronger relationships than trying to impress them with what I knew. People want to feel valuable and respected for their knowledge, not just sold to. The key was making sure the requests were genuine. People can sense when you're manufacturing ways for them to help you versus when you actually need their specific skills or perspective. Sarah could tell the difference between busy work and meaningful contribution, which is why the approach worked. This principle also helped me understand why some managers struggled with retention despite offering great benefits and compensation. They were creating dependency rather than interdependency. Their employees felt grateful but not essential, which made them vulnerable to better offers elsewhere. I learned to regularly audit my relationships, both professional and personal, to ensure I wasn't falling into the trap of one-sided giving. The strongest connections were always those where both parties felt they were contributing something unique and valuable to the other's success. What amazed me most was how this approach made me a better leader without making me manipulative. By genuinely seeking input and help from my team, I made better decisions while simultaneously building loyalty. It was strategic, but it was also authentic. I really did need their expertise, and recognizing that fact out loud made everyone more invested in our collective success. Machiavelli cautioned that a wise man never promises too much, for failing to keep his word destroys his credit. I learned this lesson the hard way when I nearly destroyed a promising business partnership by over-promising during what should have been a routine client pitch in Miami last year. The opportunity seemed perfect. A hospitality company needed help launching their new app, and I was confident my team could deliver exactly what they wanted. During the initial meeting, their CEO, Roberto, mentioned they were hoping to increase user engagement by 20% within the first quarter. Without thinking, I heard myself saying we could probably achieve 30 to 40% growth based on similar projects we'd handled. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Roberto's eyes lit up, and suddenly, the entire conversation shifted to this ambitious target I'd just created. By the end of the meeting, the 40% engagement increase had become the foundation of our contract, with bonuses tied to hitting that number and penalties for falling short. My team was horrified when I told them what I'd committed to. Our previous best result on a similar project had been 22%, and that was with ideal conditions and a much simpler app. I had essentially promised a miracle because I wanted to impress the client, and now we were all on the hook for delivering something that might be impossible. We worked 16-hour days for 3 months. We brought in additional specialists, ran extensive testing, and implemented every engagement strategy we knew. The app launched beautifully, user adoption exceeded projections, and engagement increased by 26%, which should have been a massive success. Instead, Roberto treated it like a failure because we'd missed the 40% target I'd foolishly promised. The relationship soured immediately. Roberto questioned everything we recommended, second-guessed our strategies, and eventually terminated our contract 3 months early. We lost not only the remainder of that project, but also 2 referrals he had been considering sending our way. My over-promising had turned a potential long-term partnership into a disappointing failure. 6 months later, I had another shot with a different client in the same industry. This time, I took the opposite approach. When they asked about potential engagement improvements, I said, based on industry benchmarks and our experience, a realistic target would be 15 to 20% growth in the first quarter. If we hit 20%, that would be excellent performance. We delivered 23% growth. The client was thrilled. They felt like they'd gotten exceptional value beyond what they'd paid for. They extended our contract for another year and have since referred 4 new clients to us. The exact same result that disappointed Roberto delighted this client because of how I'd framed expectations from the beginning. This experience completely changed how I approach promises in every area of my life. In dating, instead of talking about elaborate future plans on early dates, I focus on making each individual experience better than expected. In friendships, rather than promising to stay in touch constantly, I under-promise on communication frequency but over-deliver on quality when we do connect. At work, I now build buffer time into every project timeline and present conservative estimates publicly, while working toward stretch goals privately. When we finish early or exceed targets, it feels like bonus success rather than baseline expectation. This approach has actually made me more ambitious, not less, because I'm not afraid of setting internal stretch goals when the external pressure is manageable. The psychological principle is simple but powerful. Humans are wired to notice gaps between expectation and reality more than absolute performance levels. Someone who expects a 7 and gets an 8 feels better than someone who expects a 10 and gets a 9. Even though 9 is objectively better than 8, I started paying attention to how successful people managed expectations in their communication. They used phrases like "I'm hoping to" instead of "I will definitely," and based on current conditions rather than making absolute predictions. They celebrated exceeding modest projections rather than struggling to hit ambitious ones. The counterintuitive result was that conservative expectation setting actually made people trust my capabilities more, not less. When clients saw me consistently deliver beyond what I promised, they began to assume I was being conservative about other areas too, which enhanced my overall credibility rather than diminishing it. Machiavelli wrote that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. I discovered the power of strategic vulnerability during a team crisis that almost cost me my leadership position at a tech startup in Seattle 2 years ago. Our product launch had been a disaster. 3 weeks of server crashes, customer complaints flooding social media, and a scathing review in TechCrunch that basically called our app amateur hour. My team of 8 developers and designers was demoralized, and I could feel them losing confidence in my leadership. The board was asking hard questions, and I was scheduled to address the entire company at our Friday all-hands meeting. Every leadership instinct told me to project strength and confidence. I prepared a presentation focused on our recovery plan, highlighting the technical improvements we were implementing and the timeline for getting back on track. But as I rehearsed it, I realized I sounded like every other CEO giving damage control talking points. It felt hollow and disconnected from what everyone was actually experiencing. 15 minutes before the meeting, I scrapped my entire presentation. Instead, I walked into that room and started with something I'd never done as a leader. I admitted I had no idea what I was doing. I told the team that I'd been awake for 3 nights straight, not just because of the technical issues, but because I was questioning every decision I'd made as their leader over the past 6 months. The room went completely silent. You could feel the tension shift. Then I said something that surprised even me. I need your help figuring out where we went wrong because clearly my perspective alone isn't enough. I asked each department to spend the next week conducting their own post-mortem, and to come back with brutal honesty about what I could have done differently. The response was immediate and powerful. Instead of distancing themselves from the failure, my team leaned in. Sarah from design stayed late that night to walk me through user experience issues I'd been blind to. Marcus from development sent me a detailed email about technical debt we'd been accumulating. Even our junior developer, who rarely spoke in meetings, scheduled time to discuss communication problems between departments. Within 2 weeks, we had identified and addressed fundamental issues that had been festering for months. More importantly, the team's energy completely shifted. They stopped seeing the crisis as something that happened to them and started treating it as something we were solving together. The vulnerability I'd shown hadn't weakened my authority. It had made me more human and accessible. The product relaunch 6 weeks later was our most successful deployment ever. But what really stuck with me was a comment from one of our investors during the next board meeting. He said, "The way you handled that crisis showed real leadership maturity. Most founders would have tried to deflect blame or minimize the issues. Your willingness to own the failure publicly actually increased our confidence in your ability to learn and adapt." I started experimenting with calculated vulnerability in other contexts. During a difficult conversation with my girlfriend about our relationship, instead of defending my behavior, I admitted that I wasn't sure how to balance my startup demands with being a good partner. Instead of creating more conflict, this honesty led to the most productive conversation we'd ever had about expectations and support. In networking situations, I began sharing genuine challenges I was facing rather than just highlighting successes. The connections I made became deeper and more valuable because people felt they could relate to my struggles, not just admire my achievements. Successful entrepreneurs started offering advice and introductions because they remembered facing similar obstacles. The key insight was understanding the difference between weakness and vulnerability. Weakness is being overwhelmed by problems you can't handle. Vulnerability is being honest about challenges while demonstrating the strength to address them. People respect leaders who can acknowledge gaps in their knowledge or experience, especially when those leaders then take concrete steps to fill those gaps. This approach also created a filter for relationships and opportunities. People who were only interested in associating with successful personas without any depth weren't worth my time anyway. The ones who appreciated authenticity and were willing to engage with real challenges became the most valuable connections in both my professional and personal life. What surprised me most was how this principle enhanced rather than diminished my confidence. When you stop pretending to have all the answers, you can focus your energy on finding the right questions and building the relationships that help you solve them. Vulnerability became a strategic advantage, not a liability to manage. Machiavelli understood that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. I learned the brutal importance of timing during a career decision that nearly cost me everything, but ultimately taught me the most valuable lesson about strategic patience. It was October 2020, right in the middle of pandemic uncertainty, when I got the call that would test everything I thought I knew about seizing opportunities. A headhunter reached out about a VP position at a promising fintech startup in Austin. The salary was 40% higher than my current role, the equity package looked incredible, and they wanted to move fast. They needed an answer within a week. Every entrepreneur podcast and business book I'd ever consumed screamed the same message. When opportunity knocks, you answer immediately. My current company was struggling with remote work transitions. Several colleagues had been laid off, and here was this golden ticket to escape before things got worse. My gut instinct was to jump at the chance, but something felt off about the timing. The startup's aggressive timeline seemed desperate rather than confident. They were hiring a VP-level position, but couldn't wait 2 weeks for the right candidate. I decided to dig deeper before making my decision. What I discovered during my research completely changed how I evaluate opportunities. The company had just lost 2 major investors who had pulled out due to regulatory concerns in their sector. Their current runway was shorter than they were advertising, and they were essentially hiring senior talent to help pitch their next funding round. They needed someone with my background to legitimize their team for investors, but if the funding didn't come through, I'd be the most expensive person to cut. Meanwhile, at my current company, I noticed some interesting signals. Our CEO had been taking more meetings with potential partners, and there were rumors about acquisition discussions. Instead of jumping ship during turbulent times, I decided to position myself as the person helping to navigate through them. I volunteered for cross-departmental projects and made myself visible during strategic planning sessions. 6 months later, my patience paid off in ways I couldn't have imagined. The fintech startup ran out of money and shut down in February 2021. The VP they hired instead of me was unemployed after 4 months. Meanwhile, my company was acquired by a larger competitor in March, and because I'd made myself essential during the transition period, I was promoted to director with a retention package worth more than the startup opportunity would have provided. This experience taught me that timing isn't just about recognizing opportunities. It's about distinguishing between real opportunities and traps disguised as opportunities. The pressure to act quickly is often a red flag, not a green light. Companies and people who are confident in their value proposition can afford to give you time to make informed decisions. I started applying this principle to other areas of my life. In dating, I learned to be suspicious of people who pushed for quick commitments or exclusive relationships before we'd really gotten to know each other. The best relationships develop naturally over time, without artificial pressure or ultimatums. In investment opportunities, I began to notice that the limited time offers and act now pressures usually came from deals that couldn't withstand careful scrutiny. The truly valuable investments were ones where sellers were confident enough in the fundamentals to allow proper due diligence. The counterintuitive insight was that acting fast often means moving at someone else's preferred timeline, not your own. When you're being pressured to decide quickly, ask yourself who benefits from speed and who benefits from careful consideration. Usually, the person pushing for immediate action has something to hide or some advantage that disappears under closer examination. I also learned to recognize my own optimal timing for different types of decisions. I make better financial choices in the morning when my mental energy is highest. I have more productive, difficult conversations on Wednesdays when both work stress and weekend distractions are minimal. I negotiate better when I'm not hungry, tired, or dealing with other pressures. The most successful people I've observed share this quality of strategic patience. They can distinguish between genuine urgency and manufactured pressure. They understand that the right opportunity at the wrong time is often worse than no opportunity at all, and they're willing to wait for alignment between their goals and favorable circumstances. What amazed me most was how this approach actually accelerated my career progress. By avoiding poorly timed moves and bad opportunities, I had more energy and focus to invest in situations with better fundamentals and timing. Patience became a competitive advantage, not a liability. Machiavelli observed that men are so simple and obey present necessities so much that he who deceives will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. I discovered the true power of interdependence during a freelance crisis that almost destroyed my consulting business, but ended up teaching me the most valuable lesson about sustainable relationships. Back in early 2019, I was riding high as an independent marketing consultant in Phoenix. I had 3 major clients, each paying me between $8,000 and $12,000 monthly, and I felt financially secure for the first time since leaving corporate. My biggest client, a real estate development company run by a guy named Tom, represented 60% of my income. I thought I had it made. The warning signs were there, but I ignored them. Tom would sometimes pay invoices late, always had urgent requests that disrupted my other projects, and treated me more like an employee than a partner. But the money was good, so I kept prioritizing his demands over building relationships with other clients. I was completely dependent on him, but he could replace me with another consultant anytime. The crash came on a Tuesday morning in March. Tom called and said they were bringing marketing in-house and wouldn't need my services anymore. Just like that, 60% of my income vanished. No warning, no transition period, no consideration for the fact that I'd restructured my entire business around serving his company. I had 2 weeks to find replacement revenue or I'd have to shut down. That crisis forced me to completely rethink how I approached client relationships. Instead of just being a service provider that clients could easily discard, I needed to become integral to their success in ways that made replacing me costly and complicated. I needed to create mutual dependence, not just one-sided dependency. When I rebuilt my practice 6 months later, I implemented a completely different strategy. Instead of taking on large projects for individual clients, I started connecting my clients with each other. I introduced my law firm client to my real estate client when they needed legal help. I connected my e-commerce client with my graphic design client for a packaging project. Suddenly, I wasn't just a marketing consultant, I was the hub of a valuable network. My new biggest client, Jennifer, who ran a boutique hotel chain, became dependent on me not just for marketing strategy, but for the introductions I could make to vendors, partners, and other business owners in my network. At the same time, I became dependent on her insights about hospitality trends that helped me better serve my other clients. We each brought unique value that the other couldn't easily replicate elsewhere. The psychological shift was profound. Instead of hoping clients would continue to need my services, I was actively creating situations where we both lost value if our relationship ended. Jennifer couldn't just fire me and hire another marketer. She'd lose access to my network and the collaborative strategies we'd developed together. I couldn't just replace her with another hotel client. I'd lose her industry expertise and the credibility she provided with other hospitality prospects. I applied this principle to other areas of my life too. In my relationship with my girlfriend Lisa, instead of just being the person who planned dates and paid for dinners, I started involving her in my business challenges, where her HR background was actually valuable. She began involving me in her family situations, where my outsider perspective helped. We became interdependent collaborators, not just romantic companions. With friendships, I stopped being the person who always initiated contact and started creating shared projects and goals. My friend Mike and I began investing in rental properties together. My friend Sarah and I started a monthly networking dinner for professionals in our industry. These shared ventures created bonds that went beyond just enjoying each other's company. The key insight was understanding the difference between dependence and interdependence. Dependence makes relationships fragile because one person holds all the power. Interdependence makes relationships anti-fragile because both parties are invested in maintaining and improving the connection. When someone needs you as much as you need them, the relationship becomes much more stable and valuable. This approach also filtered for higher quality relationships. People who only wanted one-sided benefits weren't interested in creating mutual value, so they naturally selected themselves out. The clients, friends, and partners who embraced interdependence became the foundation of a much stronger personal and professional network. What surprised me most was how this principle made me more valuable to everyone in my network. By focusing on creating mutual benefit rather than just extracting value for myself, I became the person that others wanted to keep close and introduce to their own networks. Interdependence became a competitive advantage that compounded over time. Machiavelli wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." I learned the delicate art of strategic conflict during a neighborhood dispute that could have escalated into a legal nightmare, but instead taught me how to turn opposition into opportunity. The situation started when my neighbor Kevin decided to build a fence that extended 3 feet onto my property line in our suburban Dallas neighborhood. When I approached him politely about the survey markers, he became aggressive and told me he'd been planning this project for months and wasn't changing anything. He suggested I hire a lawyer if I had a problem with it, clearly assuming I'd back down rather than fight. My first instinct was to either avoid the conflict entirely or escalate immediately to legal action. The old me would have either accepted the property loss to keep peace or gone straight to a lawyer to prove I was right. But I'd been studying how successful people handle confrontation, and I realized this was an opportunity to practice strategic conflict management. Instead of avoiding Kevin or threatening him, I chose a third path. I knocked on his door the next evening and said, Kevin, I think we both want the same thing. Clear property boundaries that protect our investments. I've scheduled a professional survey for this weekend that will settle this definitively. Would you like to split the cost so we both have the official documentation? I framed it as solving a mutual problem, not me being right and him being wrong. Kevin initially resisted, but when I mentioned that unclear property lines could affect both our home values and future sale prospects, he agreed to the survey. The results showed he was indeed 3 feet over the line, but instead of demanding he move the fence immediately, I offered him a choice: relocate the fence to the correct boundary, or pay me fair market rent for the use of my land if he wanted to keep it there temporarily. The genius of this approach was that I gave Kevin a way to maintain dignity while still protecting my interests. He chose to pay me $200 monthly for 6 months while he planned a redesign that would work within his actual property lines. During those months, our relationship completely transformed, from adversarial to collaborative. By the time Kevin moved his fence, we had become allies. He recommended me to the Homeowners Association board when they needed someone with business experience. I introduced him to my contractor when he needed deck work done. What started as a property dispute became a valuable neighborhood relationship that has benefited both of us multiple times over the past 3 years. This experience taught me that conflict isn't something to avoid or win. It's something to direct strategically. The goal isn't to crush your opponent, but to create an outcome where both parties feel like they gained something valuable, even if they didn't get everything they originally wanted. I started applying this principle at work during team disagreements. When my colleague Amanda constantly challenged my project timelines in meetings, instead of defending my estimates or going to our boss to complain, I asked her to help me create more accurate forecasting methods. Her detail-oriented criticism became a valuable asset for improving our entire team's project management. In dating, when someone would test me with provocative comments or unreasonable demands, I learned to neither submit nor retaliate, but to redirect the energy productively. If someone complained that I didn't text enough, instead of getting defensive, I'd ask what communication style would help them feel more connected, then negotiate, something that worked for both of us. The key insight was understanding that people engage in conflict because they want something: respect, control, security, or acknowledgement. When you can identify what they actually need and find ways to provide it without sacrificing your own core interests, you transform enemies into allies. This approach also taught me how to choose my battles wisely. Not every disagreement is worth escalating into conflict, but when something genuinely matters to your long-term interests, strategic confrontation can strengthen your position and relationships rather than damaging them. What amazed me most was how this principle affected my reputation in various communities. People began seeing me as someone who could handle difficult situations diplomatically and effectively. This reputation led to opportunities to mediate other conflicts, serve on committees, and take leadership roles where conflict management skills were valued. The counterintuitive result was that by engaging in conflict more strategically, I actually experienced less stress and drama in my life. When you know how to direct confrontation productively, you're not afraid of it, which paradoxically makes people less likely to try to intimidate or manipulate you in the first place. Machiavelli observed that, since human needs change, it is necessary that methods also change. I learned this lesson during what felt like a career death sentence in the spring of 2020, when my entire industry collapsed overnight and forced me to reinvent myself or become irrelevant. I had spent 8 years building expertise as an event marketing specialist in Las Vegas. I knew every venue, every vendor, and every angle for creating memorable corporate experiences. My client roster included major tech conferences, luxury brand launches, and high-end corporate retreats. I was making 6 figures doing work I loved, and I thought I had built a recession-proof career around experiences that companies would always need. Then COVID hit. Within 2 weeks, every event I had scheduled for the next 18 months was cancelled. The entire live events industry didn't just slow down, it completely disappeared. My specialized knowledge became worthless overnight. I remember sitting in my empty home office, staring at contracts that had become meaningless pieces of paper, feeling like a typewriter repairman in the age of computers. The panic was real. I was 34 years old with highly specific skills that suddenly had no market value. My first instinct was to wait it out, assuming events would return to normal within a few months. But after 6 weeks of watching other event professionals struggle with the same denial, I realized I had to completely reimagine my career or risk becoming permanently unemployable. I forced myself to analyze what I actually did as an event marketer, not just what I called myself. I realized that my core skills were understanding audience psychology, creating engaging experiences, and managing complex logistics under pressure. These abilities weren't limited to physical events. They were transferable to any situation where you needed to capture and hold people's attention. The pivot wasn't easy. I spent 3 months learning everything I could about virtual engagement, digital marketing, and online community building. I took courses on webinar production, social media strategy, and content creation. I reached out to former clients who were struggling to engage their audiences remotely and offered to help them solve their new challenges. My first virtual event project was a disaster. The technology failed, the engagement was terrible, and I felt completely out of my depth. But I learned more from that one failure than I had from years of successful traditional events. I understood what didn't work and why, which gave me insights that most people entering the virtual space didn't have. 6 months later, I was running virtual conferences for tech companies that were more engaging and cost-effective than most in-person events had been. I had developed expertise in hybrid experiences, digital community building, and remote team engagement that made me more valuable than I had been before the pandemic. Companies that had never considered hiring an event specialist were now seeking my help with virtual employee onboarding and online customer experiences. The key insight was realizing that adaptability isn't just about learning new skills. It's about understanding the underlying principles that make you effective and finding new applications for those principles. I didn't abandon everything I knew about creating memorable experiences. I just found new mediums for applying that knowledge. This experience taught me to constantly scan for industry changes and proactively develop adjacent skills before I needed them. I started spending 1 hour each week learning about emerging technologies, new platforms, and shifting consumer behaviors. I treated continuous learning as insurance against future disruption. I also began to view my career as a portfolio of capabilities rather than a single specialized track. Instead of being an event marketer, I became someone who understood audience engagement across multiple channels. This broader identity made me more resilient and opened opportunities I never would have considered before. The psychological shift was profound. Instead of fearing change, I started looking for it as a source of competitive advantage. While others in my industry were paralyzed by uncertainty, I was experimenting with new approaches and building expertise that would be valuable in the post-pandemic world. What surprised me most was how this principle applied beyond just career challenges. I started approaching relationships, fitness, and personal interests with the same adaptability mindset. When my long-term relationship ended, instead of trying to recreate the same dynamic with someone new, I used it as an opportunity to understand what I actually wanted in a partnership and how to be a better partner myself. The most successful people I know share this quality of proactive reinvention. They don't wait for external pressure to force change. They continuously evolve their skills, perspectives, and approaches to stay ahead of shifting circumstances. They treat their current success as a platform for future growth, not a fortress to defend against change. Machiavelli understood that everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. I discovered the critical importance of controlling my own story during a professional crisis that could have destroyed my reputation, but instead became the foundation for rebuilding my career on stronger terms. It was September 2019 when my business partnership with my college roommate Jake imploded in the most public way possible. We had built a successful digital marketing agency together over 4 years, but fundamental disagreements about company direction had been festering for months. When Jake decided to leave and start a competing firm, he took 3 of our biggest clients and 2 key employees with him. The business community in our mid-sized city is small, and word traveled fast. Within a week, I was getting calls from other agency owners asking what had happened. Some clients started questioning whether our remaining team could handle their projects without Jake. Potential employees began asking about company stability during interviews. My professional reputation was being defined by other people's interpretation of events I had no control over. My first instinct was to set the record, straight by explaining Jake's betrayal, sharing details about client poaching, and defending my leadership decisions. I wanted everyone to know that I was the victim of unethical behavior, not the cause of business failure. But before I started making calls and sending emails, I remembered something my mentor had told me. People don't care about your problems. They care about your solutions. Instead of telling a story about betrayal and victimhood, I decided to craft a narrative about evolution and opportunity. When people asked about the partnership ending, I said, Jake and I realized we had different visions for scaling the business. The split gives both of us the freedom to pursue our respective strategies more effectively. When clients expressed concerns, I focused on how the changes allowed us to specialize in areas where we delivered the most value. The key was shifting from reactive explanation to proactive storytelling. Rather than defending what happened, I started painting a picture of where we were heading. I spoke about streamlining our service offerings, deepening relationships with remaining clients, and bringing in specialists who aligned with our new focused approach. I made the partnership dissolution sound like a strategic business decision, not a personal failure. Within 3 months, the narrative had completely transformed. Instead of being seen as the founder whose business partner abandoned him, I became known as the entrepreneur who had the courage to restructure for long-term success. New clients started reaching out specifically because they were attracted to our focused approach. Industry peers began asking for advice about managing business partnerships and transitions. This experience taught me that reputation isn't built on what actually happens to you, it's built on how you frame what happens to you. People form opinions based on the story you tell about your experiences, not the objective facts of those experiences. If you don't actively shape that narrative, others will create one for you, and it probably won't serve your interests. I started paying attention to how successful people talked about their setbacks and challenges. They never denied difficulties, but they always positioned them as learning experiences or stepping stones to better outcomes. They spoke about failures as data that informed better decisions, not as evidence of personal inadequacy. In dating, I learned to reframe my divorce not as a personal failure, but as evidence that I was willing to make difficult decisions when relationships weren't working. Instead of apologizing for being divorced, I spoke about what I had learned about myself and what I was looking for in a future partnership. This approach attracted partners who valued self-awareness and growth over perfect track records. With friendships and family relationships, I started being more intentional about how I discussed challenges and setbacks. Instead of venting about problems, I shared stories about how I was working to solve them. This shift made people see me as resilient and resourceful, rather than someone who was constantly struggling with life circumstances. The most powerful realization was understanding that controlling your narrative isn't about lying or manipulation. It's about choosing which true aspects of your experience to emphasize. Every situation has multiple valid interpretations. The question is whether you'll be intentional about highlighting the elements that serve your long-term goals and values. I also learned to be consistent across different audiences and platforms. The story I told networking contacts matched what clients heard, which aligned with how I presented myself on social media. This consistency made the narrative feel authentic and trustworthy rather than crafted for specific audiences. What amazed me most was how this approach actually improved my self-perception and confidence. When you practice telling empowering stories about your experiences, you start to genuinely see yourself as someone who handles challenges effectively. The narrative you create for others becomes the identity you embody for yourself. Machiavelli warned that it is not enough to conquer, one must know how to preserve. I learned this final lesson about sustainable influence during the most successful period of my career, when I almost destroyed everything I'd built by focusing on accumulating power instead of creating lasting value for others. By early 2022, I had rebuilt my consulting practice into something that exceeded my wildest expectations. I was earning more than I ever had as an employee, working with Fortune 500 clients and speaking at industry conferences. I had a team of 6 contractors, a wait list of potential clients, and the kind of professional recognition I'd dreamed about for years. I felt like I had finally made it in every measurable way. But success started changing me in ways I didn't initially recognize. I became obsessed with maintaining my position at the top of the local business community. I started viewing other consultants as competitors to be undermined rather than colleagues to collaborate with. When younger professionals asked for mentorship, I'd give vague advice instead of real help, worried about creating future competition. The wake-up call came during a conversation with my former employee Maria, who had left to start her own practice 6 months earlier. She told me that several people in our industry were describing me as successful, but not someone you'd want to work with long-term. That comment hit harder than any business failure could have, because I realized I was building a reputation for taking value rather than creating it. I had fallen into the trap that destroys most people who achieve some level of power. I started seeing my success as something to protect rather than something to leverage for greater impact. I was hoarding opportunities, knowledge, and connections instead of using them to create value for others. My focus had shifted from building something sustainable to maintaining something fragile. That weekend, I did a complete audit of my professional relationships and business practices. I realized that most of my recent success had come from extracting maximum value from existing clients and connections rather than developing new ones or helping others succeed. I was operating like a mining company strip mining resources rather than a farmer cultivating long-term growth. The next Monday, I completely changed my approach. I started introducing potential clients to competitors when their needs didn't perfectly match my capabilities. I began offering genuine mentorship to younger professionals, including sharing specific strategies and introducing them to valuable connections. I restructured my pricing to focus on long-term partnerships rather than maximizing short-term revenue. The transformation in my business and reputation was immediate and dramatic. Clients started referring more business because they trusted that I cared about their success more than my fees. Other consultants began collaborating with me on larger projects because they knew I wouldn't try to steal credit or clients. Industry organizations asked me to take leadership roles because they saw me as someone who elevated the entire community. Most importantly, I started attracting higher quality opportunities and relationships. When you're known for creating value for others, successful people want to include you in their networks and projects. When you're known for hoarding value, people work around you instead of with you, regardless of how talented you might be individually. This experience taught me that true power isn't about controlling resources or people. It's about becoming so valuable to others that they actively support your continued success. When your rise lifts others up with you, they have a vested interest in helping you stay at the top. When your success comes at others' expense, they're secretly hoping for your downfall. I applied this principle to every area of my life. In my relationship with my girlfriend Emma, I focused on how our partnership could help both of us become better versions of ourselves rather than just meeting my emotional needs. With my family, I started using my professional success to create opportunities for my siblings and parents rather than just talking about my achievements. The psychological shift was profound. When you stop seeing success as a zero-sum game where others' gains threaten your position, you can genuinely celebrate and support other people's growth. This creates a network of allies who are emotionally invested in your continued success rather than competitors looking for opportunities to replace you. I also learned to measure success differently. Instead of just tracking revenue and recognition, I started paying attention to how many people were succeeding because of opportunities I'd created or connections I'd made. The more value I created for others, the more sustainable and fulfilling my own success became. What surprised me most was how this approach accelerated rather than limited my growth. When you focus on creating value for others, You naturally develop a deeper understanding of market needs, build stronger relationships, and generate more opportunities than you could ever pursue alone. Abundance thinking became a competitive advantage, not a liability. The ultimate realization was that Machiavelli's insights weren't about becoming ruthless or manipulative. They were about understanding human nature well enough to create systems where everyone benefits from your success. The princes who lasted weren't those who ruled through fear, but those who made themselves indispensable to their people's prosperity and security. Looking back now, I understand that real power isn't about being feared or even loved. It's about being genuinely needed. When you use your influence to create lasting value for others, you build something that survives economic downturns, industry, changes, and personal setbacks. You become anti-fragile because your success is interconnected with others' success, creating a network that strengthens under pressure rather than breaking.